Hello, today I'm going to be talking about the LG G5 and whether or not it's worth it in 2018. Now, I just recently upgraded from the LG G5 myself, and I'd been using it for about 6 months or so, and I wanted to give my thoughts and impressions on it. Now, I'm someone who likes to see good specs on a phone, which is the reason I bought the LG G5. I found out a good deal. It was something around $100, $110 refurbished. So I saw the specs on it and thought this is definitely a good deal. Nowadays you can find it for even cheaper. I found it refurbished on eBay for about $70 recently, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less when you're watching this. However, it's a pretty cheap Android phone and it's got amazing specs, pretty comparable to some of the phones that are out today. For example, it's got 4 gigs of RAM, which is pretty common to see on some of the higher end phones of today, even though it was released about 2 or 3 years ago. It was a very high-end phone when it was released, and it also sports a screen resolution of 1440 by 2560, which is pretty high. Most of the phones nowadays are maybe marginally higher. To get better specs than this phone, you're probably going to have to spend close to $300-400. So you may be wondering, why is the LG G5 so cheap compared to some of the other phones that are out nowadays? And why aren't more people just getting this phone? Well, there's a couple reasons for that. Now, phones nowadays are getting to a point of diminishing returns, similar to computers a few years ago. Now, it used to be every time a new phone was released, it would have much better specs, better screen resolution, it'd probably have more RAM. Nowadays, we're not seeing that change so much. Most phones today now are finally starting to get to around 6 gigs of RAM, but this has 4, which isn't too different. And also, the screen resolution isn't getting that much better. We're getting to a point where we're barely able to notice the difference between, 400 and 450 or 500 DPI. So really, there's not too big of a difference specs-wise between the LG G5 and these newer phones. But there are a lot of problems with the LG G5. The phone, I guess, was probably a little rushed to production because there's a lot of just pretty obvious problems that this phone has. For example, the biggest problem I've seen is the fingerprint sensor. And I'm not exactly sure why, but for my phone at least, it only works if you press it in this bottom left corner of the phone. Otherwise, you're not really going to be getting anything from it. As you can see, if I'm pressing in the top right corner, nothing is happening. I'm pressing it down, now I'm going to press that bottom left, and there it goes, there it locks. So it's a little bit of a problem. I got used to it and don't even notice it now, but I'm assuming for some phones it's probably worse than that. I actually bought another LG G5 because I found it on sale, and it had the similar problem. So it seems to be a very common problem. I saw there was a solution where you can put, I think, like rubbing alcohol on a Q-tip and clean it out, and that actually works. Don't quote me on that. I don't want you wrecking your phones. Watch the video. But I did that, and it didn't really fix the problem that I had. So, I mean, the fingerprint sensor still works and is pretty fast, but that is a pretty large problem if the lock button doesn't work half the time, or in most of the area. You only can press it in that certain location. So that's a pretty big problem. I see a lot of people have that. Some other downsides are I get a lot of screen bleeding. Now, if I'm on a screen for a little bit and switch to a different app, a lot of times I can see, like, for example, the keyboard will be kind of in the bottom of it. I can't really replicate that right now, but it is definitely a problem that I get all the time, where I open multiple apps and you can kind of see a shadow of the previous app open. Something is wrong with the screen on it. I'm not exactly sure, but I also see that's a common problem that people have. It's not just me having this problem. And I was only using the phone for maybe up to around 6 months, so it is a pretty large problem. For some people, it may not matter. Some people will barely notice it. It's mostly visible if you have a white background. If you got a dark background on the app that you're using, you're not going to notice it at all. But if you're using an app like maybe Google Chrome, where everything in the background is white, it's going to be pretty obvious. The last big problem I have is battery life of this phone. Now, the battery itself is not too bad. It's a 2800 milliamp hour battery, which isn't too bad. Like, that's pretty comparable to other phones. I think it's actually pretty high. However, because of the kind of big specs it has, a really high screen resolution, a lot of RAM, I don't know how much of a factor that is, I have found that it actually isn't too great battery-wise. Early on, it wasn't too bad, but as the phone got a little bit older, it was very noticeable. There's no way I was going to be able to get a full day's worth out of the phone, even if I wasn't using it that often. And if you're using it for things like Google Maps or anything like that that is pretty battery draining, you're going to see a very quick dip. Also, the phone can get very hot at times, I've noticed, which can cause it to kind of slow down. Now, I don't know how related those are, if the phone was already hot and then that caused the app slow down, or if it was hot because I had so many apps open or running. But a lot of times when I'm using kind of newer apps, like for example, if I was ever opening Snapchat, a lot of times it would take a little bit to load. It would be a little laggy if I had a couple other apps running sort of in the background. And really, if I was hot outside and the phone was already a little warm, sometimes it would just crash by itself just from Snapchat, which isn't even that big of an app. So definitely has some problems with that as well. Enough of the negatives though. I'd like to focus on some of the positives of this phone, because there is a lot of great things about this phone despite being 2 to 3 years old. Now, one of the biggest things I have noticed is the screen resolution is amazing. It's a great resolution phone. It's really comparable to a lot of the newer phones, and some of the newest phones that are coming out actually have a worse screen resolution than this phone. They're coming out for $500-600, and you can get the same resolution on a $100 phone like this. So really, that is a really nice thing for me, so you can watch YouTube videos and they look super crisp. Another thing is the 4 gigs of RAM is pretty nice. I didn't really notice too many slowdowns early on when I was using it. However, lately it may be bottlenecked by that, but it's not going to be too commonly bottlenecked by the 4 gigs of RAM. Now, the camera itself is pretty solid. The rear camera is pretty nice, not as great as the cameras nowadays, but pretty solid for its time, and the selfie camera is actually really nice. The front camera is, I think, only 8 megapixels, but it does look pretty nice. It can really rival some of the better cameras out there nowadays. So really, you're not going to be too much worse than a lot of your friends if you have the LG G5. So overall, in 2018, is it worth it? Now, I would say no. For most people, if you have $70 to spend and you are looking for a phone with nice specs, it probably is, but other than that, you're probably better off getting a slightly better phone. I would recommend the LG V20, which is a phone with almost the exact same specs that this has, but it seemed to fix a lot of the problems. The LG G5 seems pretty rushed out of production, but if you want those nice specs on a slightly better phone, LG V20 is probably the way to go, or find something with pretty similar specs. If you only do have those $70 to spend though, I'd recommend getting something with slightly worse specs and maybe doesn't have all the problems that the LG G5 does have. But for some people, this may be worth it. Overall, probably not. You're probably a little better off spending just a little bit more money to fix some of those problems. If these problems aren't a big issue to you, if you think that the lock screen thing isn't too big of a deal, you can probably fix that. Or the screen bleeding isn't that big of a deal, you're not using a lot of white apps or apps with a white background, then maybe it is for you. But for me, I would have rather had something like the LG V20, which has basically the same specs, but costs a bit more. You're probably going to be running around $120 to $150 for something like that. So that's about it for this video. I don't have many videos like this. If you want to see more like this, please let me know in the comments. This was my first comparison, so let me know what you guys think. If there's anything else you would have liked to have known about the phone, please let me know. Maybe I can answer your comments about it. I didn't use the LG G5 that long, probably only around 4 to 6 months, so I didn't get to explore the phone as much as someone who had it for a couple years maybe, but it's a pretty decent phone, but it does have its issues. So I was very impressed by the specs, which is why I got it. I knew about the issues beforehand, but was hoping maybe it won't happen to me, but it seems to be happening to just about everyone. So thank you guys for watching. I come out with 2 new videos a week, Tuesdays and Fridays. If you like these videos, please subscribe. So thank you again for watching. Peace.